White. Too much white. It burned against the backs of his eyelids. Draco tried to close them tighter. It didn't work. The light was absolute. He tried to move his arm to shield his face, but his muscles felt like lead. They refused the command. Panic spiked. Cold and sharp. He needed his wand. He reached for his pocket. For his sleeve. For anything familiar. Nothing. A searing heat flared around his right wrist. It wasn't a burn. It was magic. Hot, heavy, and ancient. It pulsed in time with his racing heartbeat. He forced his eyes open. The room was aggressively sterile. Pale green walls. Crisp white sheets. The sharp smell of medicinal potions. Saint Mungo's. He tried to sit up. His body rebelled. He managed a pathetic half-turn before collapsing back onto the thin pillows, gasping for air. Easy, mate. The voice came from the corner. Drawling. Relaxed. Utterly out of place in a hospital room. Draco blinked until the blurry figure resolved. Blaise Zabini. Impeccably tailored in a dark charcoal suit, lounging in a plastic visitor's chair as if it were a leather armchair at his club. He was flipping through a copy of the Daily Prophet, looking entirely too bored. Zabini, Draco rasped. His throat felt like sandpaper. Where is my wand? Blaise didn't move. He just lowered the paper and watched Draco with an expression that bordered on pity. Draco hated pity. Locked away, Blaise said softly. You won't be needing it for a while. Why am I here? Draco demanded. He looked down at his right arm. There, wrapped around his wrist like a glowing thread, was a silver scar. It hummed. It felt alive. What is this? Draco asked, his voice cracking. He tried to pull at the magic, but it burned brighter, stinging his skin. Blaise leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. That, my friend, is a very long story. One that the healers insist I let them tell you. The door opened before Draco could argue. A healer stepped in. Crisp robes. A clipboard hovering beside him. He stopped at the foot of the bed. Mr. Malfoy, the healer said. He sounded profoundly relieved. You are awake. Brilliant deduction, Draco snapped. Now tell me what is wrong with my arm. The healer exchanged a long, weighted look with Blaise. Draco hated being out of the loop. Mr. Malfoy, what is the last thing you remember? The healer asked, picking up his clipboard. Draco tried to think. There was a mission in the Department of Mysteries. A rogue curse. The floor crumbling. The smell of ozone and blood. The Department of Mysteries, Draco said. March 2003. Silence filled the room. Nobody spoke. Mr. Malfoy. The healer started slowly. It is currently May 2005. Draco stopped breathing. 2 years. He had lost 2 years of his life. And the scar? Draco asked, feeling entirely hollow. It didn't sound like his own voice. An unbreakable vow, the healer explained gently. You made it shortly before the incident that caused your coma. Your magic has been sustaining it while you were unconscious. It is the reason you survived, but it is also the reason your magic is currently fractured. An unbreakable vow. Draco glanced at his wrist. Who would he possibly make an unbreakable vow with? To do what? He didn't make vows. He made calculations. He weighed risks. An unbreakable vow was a death sentence waiting to happen. To whom? Draco asked. And for what? The door opened again. Draco looked up. Hermione Granger stood in the doorway. She stopped dead when she saw him awake. Her hair was pulled into a messy knot, with stray curls clinging to her neck. Deep purple shadows stood out starkly under her eyes. She wore a faded blue jumper that looked 3 sizes too big, and her knuckles were white inside the pockets. She didn't speak. Blaise said from the corner. Perfect timing. Draco glared at him, then back at Granger. He was stripped bare in his hospital gown, missing his wand, missing his memories. He needed a weapon, and his tongue was the only one left. Did I lose a bet, Granger? Draco asked, his tone dripping with practiced disdain. Or did the ministry simply run out of qualified healers and decide to punish me with your bedside manner? Granger didn't snap back. She didn't roll her eyes. She didn't even look angry. She just swallowed hard. Her hands tightened in her pockets. She took a slow step into the room, keeping a careful distance from the bed, moving like she was approaching a wild animal. You're awake, she whispered. Her voice was thin. Brittle. Yes, we've established that, Draco sneered. The confusion was making him cruel. He needed control. He needed to understand why the Golden Girl was in his hospital room looking like she hadn't slept in a month. Now, if you wouldn't mind leaving, the healer was just about to tell me whose life I apparently traded mine for. Blaise laughed. It was a short, sharp sound. He doesn't know, Blaise said directly to Granger. Granger flinched. A tiny, nearly invisible flinch. But Draco saw it. She took a step back and crossed her arms tightly over her chest. She looked away, studying the floor tiles with desperate intensity. Tell him, she said to the healer. Her voice shook slightly. The healer cleared his throat. Mr. Malfoy, the vow binds you to protect Miss Granger. Draco froze. He looked at Granger, but she refused to meet his eyes. His gaze dropped to the glowing silver scar on his wrist, and then snapped up to Blaise, who was watching them with terrifying amusement. You're lying, Draco said. I assure you, I'm not, the healer replied calmly. The magic is tied directly to her life force. The closer she is to you, the more stable your magic becomes. It is why she has been sitting by your bed for the last 2 years. Draco felt the air leave the room. 2 years. She had been sitting by his bed for 2 years. Why? They hated each other. They had always hated each other. She was a swot. He was a bully. They worked in different departments. They didn't speak. Except, apparently, they did. His mind spun, searching for purchase in the empty space of his missing memories. He found nothing. Just a terrifying blankness where his own life should be. And in the center of it, Granger. Get out, Draco said. Granger looked up. Her eyes were bright. Too bright. Malfoy, I said get out. He shouted, his voice cracking on the final syllable. The silver scar flared instantly. A sharp, stinging burn shot up his arm, bright and angry. He gasped, grabbing his wrist as the magic seared his skin. The vow reacts to distress. The healer warned quickly, stepping forward. And to distance. If she leaves the ward while your magic is this unstable, the vow will perceive it as a threat to her safety. I don't care, Draco gritted out through his teeth, clutching his arm. I want her out of here. Granger didn't argue. She turned on her heel. I'll wait in the hall, she announced. She walked out without looking back. The second the door clicked shut behind her, the magic in Draco's wrist turned from a burn into a violent, pulling ache. It wasn't just pain. It was a physical compulsion. A desperate, clawing need to follow her, to be between her and whatever danger the vow imagined was outside that door. He swung his legs over the side of the bed. Draco, don't, Blaise warned, finally sitting up, the paper slipping from his lap. Draco ignored him. He planted his bare feet on the cold floor and tried to stand. His legs buckled immediately. He hit the floor hard, his knees taking the brunt of the impact. The air rushed out of his lungs. The door flew open. Granger was there. She had heard the crash. She rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside him. Malfoy, what are you doing? You've been asleep for 2 years. You can't just walk. She reached out to grab his shoulder. Draco recoiled away from her touch, sliding back against the metal bed frame. Don't touch me. She stopped. Her hand hovered in the air between them. Then, she stood up. She retreated a step, holding herself defensively again, her face returning to a mask of efficient detachment. Fine, she said coldly. But you need to get back in the bed. She turned to grab the healer's attention, but her boot caught on the slick leg of the metal bedside table. She tripped and fell backward. Draco didn't think. The silver thread on his wrist flared with blinding light. His right arm shot out, moving faster than his atrophied muscles should have allowed, fueled entirely by the ancient magic carved into his skin. He caught her wrist. He pulled her hard against his chest, bracing his back against the floor to break her fall. They landed together in a tangle of limbs and hospital blankets. Silence fell over the room again. Granger was sprawled across his chest. Her breath was coming fast, warm against his collarbone. She smelled like parchment and vanilla. Draco looked at his own hand in disbelief. His fingers were locked in an iron grip around her forearm. His thumb was pressed exactly over her pulse point on the inside of her wrist. It felt completely, terrifyingly natural. His pulse raced. The vow on his wrist was no longer burning. It was humming. A warm, contented, almost purring sensation against his skin. He had moved without thinking. His body had known exactly what to do. Exactly how to catch her. Exactly where to touch her. He looked up at Granger's face. Her eyes locked onto his. She went perfectly still, her breathing shallow, her lips slightly parted as she looked down at the way his hand was wrapped around her arm. Welcome back, mate, Blaise said from his chair, his drawl breaking the silence. Try not to murder your magical tether. She's been very cross without you. Draco didn't look at Blaise. He couldn't take his eyes off Granger. He didn't remember her. He didn't remember the vow. He didn't remember why she smelled like vanilla. But as he held her there on the cold hospital floor, his magic settled into a deep, undeniable relief. She was safe. She was here. And he had no idea what to do with that. 2 days later, the ministry atrium was hollow and echoing at 8 in the evening. Hermione liked it this way. Fewer people to ask how she was doing. Fewer sympathetic looks from colleagues who knew she had spent every weekend for 2 years sitting in St. Mungo's. She rubbed her temples, staring down at the cursed music box sitting on the polished golden desk of the security checkpoint. It was a low-level artifact. A routine sweep. Nothing that required a senior cursebreaker, but she had volunteered anyway. Staying busy meant not thinking about the hospital ward. Not thinking about the way his thumb had pressed against her pulse point. Not thinking about the fact that Draco was being moved back to Malfoy Manor tonight, and she was expected to move in with him. Just standard containment, Miss Granger, the security wizard said, stifling a yawn behind a copy of Witch Weekly. Aurors pulled it from a raid in Nocturne. Probably just a biting jinx on the latch. I'll handle it, Hermione said, her voice crisp. Professional. She drew her wand. She needed the distraction. She tapped the lid of the wooden box, murmuring a standard unlatching charm. The box didn't just open. It spat. A sharp, crackling spark of purple magic shot out from the latch, ricocheting off the marble counter with a loud crack. Hermione flinched backward out of pure reflex. She threw up a shield charm, though it was entirely unnecessary. The spark hit the floor and fizzled out harmlessly into a wisp of foul-smelling smoke. Merlin's beard, the security guard muttered, dropping his magazine. Jumpy little thing. Hermione lowered her wand, taking a slow breath to steady her racing pulse. Yes. Just a minor backfire. I'll have it contained in A. A sound like a thunderclap shattered the quiet of the atrium. The air pressure dropped violently. The security wizard shouted, diving behind his desk with his hands over his ears. Hermione spun around, her wand raised instinctively. Draco Malfoy was standing in the center of the atrium. He looked wild. He stood barefoot in black silk pajama bottoms and an unbuttoned white shirt, his pale hair sticking up at odd angles. He was breathing in ragged, gasping heaves, his chest rising and falling rapidly. And his right wrist was glowing with a blinding, incandescent silver light. He didn't look at the security desk. He didn't look at the golden statues or the empty fireplaces. His eyes locked instantly onto Hermione. Before she could even register what was happening, he moved. He crossed the distance between them in 3 long, frantic strides. He grabbed her. His hands were surprisingly strong. He gripped her upper arms and spun her around, shoving her behind him so his body was shielding hers from the empty atrium. He had no wand. He raised his bare hands, magic crackling visibly in the air around his fingers, his eyes scanning the empty room for a threat. Malfoy! Hermione gasped, stumbling against his back. He didn't look at her. His gaze darted to the security wizard, who was slowly peering over the edge of the desk, terrified. Who attacked you? Draco demanded. His voice was a harsh, guttural snarl that echoed off the marble walls. Nobody attacked me. Hermione shouted. She grabbed the back of his unbuttoned shirt, trying to pull him away from the terrified guard. It was a music box. Draco finally turned his head. He looked down at her. His eyes were wide, dilated with pure adrenaline. The silver scar on his wrist was glowing so brightly it cast harsh shadows across his sharp cheekbones. A music box, he repeated. He sounded out of breath. A minor biting jinx. Hermione explained rapidly, her own heart hammering against her ribs. She was entirely too close to his bare chest. She could feel the heat coming off his skin. It sparked. I stepped back. That's all. Draco studied her face. He looked from her eyes, down to her hands, checking for injuries. When he found none, the wild energy seemed to drain out of him all at once. His shoulders slumped. He looked down at his glowing wrist, then around at the massive, echoing ministry atrium. He realized he was standing barefoot in the Ministry of Magic in open pajamas. The silver light on his wrist began to dim, fading back to a dull, throbbing scar. "You are infuriating," Draco said. His voice was barely a whisper, thick with exhaustion. "I didn't do anything." Hermione snapped, acutely aware of the security wizards still watching them. "You're the one who apparate halfway across London without a wand." "I didn't apparate," Draco snapped back, glaring at her. "I was sitting in my library. The vow ripped me through the wards. It felt like I was being dragged by a hook through the navel." Hermione went perfectly still. The healers had warned them the vow was volatile. They hadn't warned her it could bypass ancient pureblood wards and apparition limits just to force them together. "We need to get out of here," Hermione said quickly, stepping forward to grab his arm. "Before someone calls the prophet." "Don't tell me what to do, Granger." He muttered, but he didn't pull away when her fingers wrapped around his forearm. She turned on the spot. The atrium vanished. They landed in the foyer of Malfoy Manor. The silence of the house pressed in around them instantly. The air was cool, smelling of beeswax and old paper. Hermione let go of his arm immediately. She retreated a large step, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. She squeezed her elbows, trying to stop her hands from shaking. Draco swayed slightly on his feet. A forced apparition, combined with whatever magic the vow had used to drag him to the ministry, had clearly taken a toll on his still recovering body. He braced one hand against the dark wood of a side table, closing his eyes. "Malfoy, you need to sit down," Hermione said, her voice strictly professional. She hated how much she wanted to reach out and steady him. "I'm perfectly fine." He bit out. "You nearly collapsed just now." "I am adjusting to the fact that my magical core is being held hostage by a clumsy ministry bureaucrat." He shot back, opening his eyes. He wasn't glaring anymore. He was just looking at her, his expression entirely unreadable in the dim light of the foyer. He pushed off the table and took a slow step toward her. Hermione retreated another step, her arms crossed tighter. Draco stopped. He noticed the movement. He looked at her defensive posture, then up to her face. "You don't have to protect me from a misfiring hex, Malfoy," Hermione said, breaking the silence before it could get too heavy. "I am a curse breaker. I handle dangerous magic every day." Draco flexed his right hand. The silver scar shifted against his pale skin. "Tell that to my bloody wrist, Granger," he snapped. But he didn't walk away. His hand was still hovering inches from her spine, as if fighting the urge to reach out and make sure she was actually whole. Hermione looked away. She couldn't look at his bare chest. She couldn't look at the unbuttoned shirt that she used to steal on Sunday mornings. She couldn't look at the man who was standing so close, yet felt thousands of miles away. "You should get some rest," Hermione said to the floor. "I'll be in the guest wing." "No, you won't," Draco said flatly. Hermione snapped her head up. Excuse me? The healers said distance is a trigger, Draco said, his tone clipped. If the vow considers a sparking music box a mortal threat, what do you think it will do if you sleep in the East Wing while I'm in the West? It's a large house, Hermione argued weakly. We can test the limits. I'm not letting this bloody curse drag me out of bed again tonight because you stubbed your toe in a different postcode, Draco interrupted. You were sleeping in the room next to mine. Hermione's stomach twisted. The room next to his. The one with the connecting door. The room she had slept in dozens of times before the incident. That's unnecessary, she said quickly. Draco narrowed his eyes. Why are you being so difficult about this? We are currently bound by an archaic, highly unstable magic. Logic dictates we minimize the risks. Logic. He was using logic against her. It was entirely unfair. I value my privacy, Hermione lied smoothly. And I value my magical core, Draco countered, taking another step closer. Which is currently tethered to your apparent inability to avoid exploding boxes. Hermione held her ground this time, refusing to step back again. He was standing close enough that she could see the faint pulse beating in his throat. The smell of him bergamot and sharp magic was overwhelmingly familiar. Fine, Hermione said, her voice tight. The room next to yours. But keep the connecting door closed. Draco looked at her for a long, heavy moment. His eyes dropped to her mouth, just for a fraction of a second, before snapping back up to her eyes. As you wish, Granger. He murmured. He turned and walked toward the grand staircase. Hermione stayed frozen in the foyer, watching him go. Her heart was breaking all over again. He was so fiercely protective. He was so completely him. But he didn't remember why. She uncrossed her arms, letting her hands fall loosely to her sides as she steeled herself. She had to survive this break the vow, give him his life back, and walk away before she completely lost herself. Taking a slow breath, she followed him up the stairs. The Malfoy Manor library was supposed to be his sanctuary. For the past week, it had been a prison. Draco sat in the high-backed leather armchair by the fire, a book open in his lap. He hadn't turned a page in 45 minutes. He was entirely focused on the witch sitting on the velvet sofa opposite him. Granger was reading. She had been reading in that exact spot for 3 hours. She hadn't spoken a word, but her presence was louder than a howler. She knew the room. That was the thing that was currently driving him mad. He watched her over the top of his book, cataloguing the terrifying casualness with which she navigated his ancestral home. When she had walked in, she had stepped precisely over the third floorboard near the entrance, the only one that creaked. She hadn't even looked down. She had just known. When she went to the shelves, she hadn't wondered. She had walked directly to the restricted section, bypassing the Dicker volumes, and pulled out a heavy text on ancient bindings. And then there was the sweater. She was wearing a dark green, cable-knit sweater. It was entirely too large for her. The sleeves swallowed her hands, and the hem fell past her thighs. It was his sweater. He recognized the stitching on the collar. He remembered buying it in Paris. He had absolutely no memory of giving it to her. She had just appeared downstairs wearing it, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Draco flexed his right hand. The silver scar around his wrist flared briefly, a dull, satisfied pulse of warmth. The vow loved it when she was in the same room. It was practically purring. The flue network roared to life behind him. Green flames erupted in the massive stone fireplace. Blaise Zabini stepped out, brushing a speck of ash from the lapel of his immaculate navy suit. "Good evening, inmates," Blaise drawled, stepping onto the Persian rug. Granger didn't look up from her book. "Hello, Blaise." Draco glared at his friend. "Is there a reason you insist on treating my home like a public house?" "I was in the neighborhood," Blaise said smoothly. He walked over to the drink cart, entirely unbothered. He poured himself a glass of fire whiskey. "And I wanted to see if the two of you had murdered each other yet." "Give it time," Draco muttered, finally snapping his book shut. Blaise took a sip of his drink, his dark eyes sliding over to the sofa. He paused, the glass halfway to his mouth. A slow, highly amused smile spread across his face. "Fascinating," Blaise said, his voice dropping into a theatrical whisper. Draco frowned. "What?" Blaise gestured vaguely toward the sofa with his glass. "What the vow forces one to wear. Truly, ancient magic works in mysterious ways." Granger finally looked up. She blinked, looking down at the oversized green sweater covering her. A furious blush immediately stained her cheeks. She pulled the sleeves down further over her hands, her posture stiffening. "The manor is drafty," she said defensively, her voice a bit too loud. "And my own jumpers are at my flat." "Of course," Blaise agreed, his eyes dancing with mischief. "It is purely a matter of thermal regulation. I'm sure the fact that it smells exactly like his cologne is completely incidental." Draco's grip tightened on the armrests of his chair. He didn't remember giving it to her. But the thought of her wrapped in his clothes, smelling like him, sent a sharp, possessive thrill straight through his chest. He hated it. He hated not being in control of his own reactions. "Zabini, if you're only here to antagonize my magical tether, you know where the flue is," Draco said coldly. Blaise raised his hands in surrender, though the grin didn't leave his face. "I am merely an observer of nature, Draco. The fragile ecosystem of the Malfoy library. You are a pest." Granger muttered, burying her face back in her book. Blaise chuckled, finishing his drink in one swallow. He set the glass down on the cart. "I have a dinner engagement in Milan. Try not to destroy the West Wing while I'm gone." He stepped back into the fireplace. "And Draco?" Blaise added, right before he dropped the flue powder. "What?" "She looks better in green than you ever did." The flames flared, and Blaise was gone. The silence crashed back down on the room, heavier than before. Granger didn't look up, but Draco could see the tension radiating off her shoulders. She was holding the book so tightly her knuckles were white. "You can keep it," Draco said abruptly. She froze. "What?" "The sweater," he said, keeping his voice carefully bored. "You can keep it. Green isn't my color anyway." She physically stepped back, even though she was sitting down. She pressed herself deeper into the cushions, her arms crossing instinctively over her chest, burying her hands in the long sleeves. "I don't want it," she said quickly. "Brittle. I was just cold. Clearly." She stood up abruptly, closing the book with a loud snap. "I'm going to bed," she announced, not looking at him. "It's 8 o'clock." Draco pointed out. "I am tired," she countered sharply. She turned on her heel and marched out of the library, leaving the heavy wooden door open behind her. Draco watched her go. The moment she left the room, the silver scar on his wrist gave a sharp, warning twinge. He ignored it. He picked his book back up and opened it. He needed space. He needed 5 bloody minutes without her exhausting, fascinating presence invading his thoughts. 10 minutes passed. The twinge turned into an ache. 20 minutes passed. The ache turned into a burning sensation, crawling up his forearm. Draco gritted his teeth, forcing his eyes to track across the page. He was not a dog on a leash. He was not going to follow her every time she left the room. 30 minutes passed. The magic snapped. A blinding, searing pain shot straight through his right arm, violently intense. The book dropped from his hands, hitting the floor with a heavy thud. He gasped, grabbing his wrist. It felt like someone had driven a red-hot iron nail directly into his magical core. He stumbled out of the chair, his breath coming in short, painful bursts. The adjoining room. She was supposed to be in the adjoining room. The vow tolerated the adjoining room. He staggered out of the library and up the grand staircase. The pain wasn't subsiding. It was getting worse with every step, pulling him physically to the left. Not the adjoining room. He followed the pull, his jaw clenched against the agony. Down the corridor. Past the guest wing. He found her 3 hallways away. She was in one of the dusty, unused sitting rooms in the east wing. She was curled into a tight ball on a faded chaise lounge, her knees pulled to her chest, her face buried in the oversized green sweater. The door was wide open. Draco leaned heavily against the door frame, his chest heaving, his right arm trembling from the aftershocks of the magical reprimand. "What?" he rasped. "Are you doing?" Granger's head snapped up. Her eyes were red. She had been crying. Draco's breath hitched. The sight of her tears hit him harder than the burning in his arm. "I couldn't sleep," she whispered, quickly wiping her cheeks with the sleeve of his sweater. "In the room next to mine," Draco said, pushing off the door frame. He took a step into the room. The pain in his wrist instantly halved. "It was too close," she said, her voice shaking. She looked away, fixing her eyes on the dark window. "I could hear you breathing through the door. It was too close." Draco watched her. He understood. He understood the suffocating pressure of it. The terrifying intimacy of a bond he didn't ask for and didn't remember making. But his magic didn't care about her boundaries. "Granger," Draco said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. "The vow is threatening to sever my hand because you are 3 hallways away." She flinched. "Come back here," he demanded softly, holding her gaze. "And read your atrocious novel where I can see you." She looked at his pale face, his trembling arm, and the glowing silver thread wrapped around his wrist. Without arguing, she uncurled her legs, wrapped her arms tightly around herself, and walked past him. Draco followed her. They walked in silence all the way back to the library. The fire had burned down to embers, casting long, shifting shadows across the towering bookshelves. Granger didn't go back to her book. She walked over to the velvet sofa, kicked off her shoes, and laid down. She pulled her knees up, making herself as small as possible, turning her face toward the back of the sofa. Draco sat back down in his armchair. He didn't open his book. He just watched her. The silence in the room wasn't peaceful. It was highly charged, vibrating with the echoes of the argument and the lingering sting of the vow. He watched the slow, steady rise and fall of her shoulders beneath the green wool, the way the firelight caught the messy curls spilling over the velvet cushion. He hated that he didn't know her, that there were 2 entire years of his life locked away in the dark, and she held all the keys. He flexed his right hand. The vow was quiet now. It hummed against his pulse, completely satisfied. An hour passed. Her breathing deepened, evening out into the soft, rhythmic cadence of sleep. Draco didn't move. He couldn't take his eyes off her. The library was growing cold. The draft from the massive windows crept across the floorboards. Without thinking, Draco raised his left hand. A silent, wandless summoning charm. A heavy, fur-lined blanket slipped off the back of a distant armchair and floated across the room. It settled gently over Granger's sleeping form, tucking itself around her shoulders. Granger sighed in her sleep, burying her face deeper into the collar of his sweater. Draco looked down at his right wrist. The silver scar flared briefly, glowing with a warm, contented, absolute certainty. He didn't remember falling in love with her. But his magic clearly hadn't forgotten a thing. It had been raining for 3 days straight. The relentless drum of water against the heavy glass windows of Malfoy Manor was doing nothing for Hermione's frayed nerves. She was sitting on the floor of the drawing room, surrounded by a fortress of ministry scrolls. She had demanded they be sent via Owl. Working gave her an excuse not to look at him. It wasn't working very well. Draco was pacing. He had been pacing for the better part of an hour, a restless, caged energy rolling off him in waves. He wore dark trousers and a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. The silver scar on his right wrist caught the low light every time he turned. The manor was massive, but the vow had decided that they needed to be within visual range of each other at all times. If she left the room, his wrist would start to burn. If he wandered too far down the hall, she would hear him sharp intake of breath. They were trapped. Are you going to pace a trench into the rugs, or are you eventually going to sit down? Hermione asked, not looking up from her translation of a goblin treaty. Draco stopped. He turned slowly on his heel to face her. I am attempting to expend energy, Granger, he said smoothly. Given that I am not allowed to leave the grounds, ride my broom, or use a wand for another week. Pacing is highly inefficient. She muttered, dipping her quill into the inkwell. Perhaps you should provide me with some of your fascinating ministry drivel. He countered, stepping closer to her makeshift fortress. I could categorize standard cauldron thickness regulations until my brain melts. Hermione physically retreated an inch, pulling her knees closer to her chest. She hated how hyper-aware she was of him. You wouldn't understand this anyway, she said defensively. It's a 14th century dialect of gobbledegook. The syntax is notoriously tricky, and the translations require a deep understanding of early goblin rebellions. Draco raised a pale eyebrow. I am perfectly fluent in gobbledegook, Granger. It was a requirement of my inheritance. I could translate that scroll with my eyes closed. He stepped over a stack of scrolls and sank to the floor directly across from her. He was entirely too close. Try me, he challenged softly. Hermione looked blankly at the parchment in front of her. The runes were blurring together. She could smell the bergamot soap he used. She could hear the quiet rhythm of his breathing. She reached for a different scroll, needing a distraction. She grabbed the edge of a thick, magically sealed parchment. She pulled. The edge of the parchment sliced cleanly across the index finger of her left hand. Ouch! She hissed, dropping the scroll. A thin line of bright red blood welled up instantly. It stung sharply. Before she could even reach for her wand, Draco moved. The silver thread on his wrist flared with a sudden, brilliant light. His hand shot out, catching her left wrist in a grip that was shockingly gentle. Hermione went perfectly still. "Malfoy, it's just a paper cut," she said quickly. Her voice was breathy. He didn't let go. He pulled her hand closer, his grey eyes focused entirely on the small bead of blood on her finger. "The vow doesn't distinguish between a paper cut and a severing charm, Granger," he murmured. He didn't have his wand. He didn't need it. He pressed the pad of his right thumb directly over the cut on her finger. A warm, golden spark of wandless magic passed from his skin into hers. The sting vanished instantly. He pulled his thumb back. The cut was gone. Not even a faint red line remained. Hermione couldn't breathe. He was still holding her hand. His fingers were wrapped loosely around her palm. His thumb rested against her pulse point, stroking a slow, entirely unconscious circle against her skin. The vow on his wrist wasn't just humming. It was vibrating, casting a warm, silvery glow across both of their hands. She needed to pull away. The healers had said physical contact would soothe the vow. They hadn't warned her it would feel like a live wire. She didn't move. Draco looked up from her hand. His eyes met hers. They were dark, heavy, stripped of the usual aristocratic boredom. He didn't pull away either. The silence in the drawing room stretched, thick and suffocating, punctuated only by the steady drum of the rain against the glass. He shifted his weight, leaning slightly forward. His gaze dropped from her eyes to her mouth. The air left Hermione's lungs. He was going to kiss her. He leaned in closer. She could feel the heat radiating from him. She could see the faint smattering of freckles across the bridge of his nose that he hated. She remembered tracing those freckles with her fingertips on Sunday mornings. She remembered the way he would laugh, a soft, breathless sound that he only ever made for her. Her eyes fluttered shut instinctively. He paused, his mouth a fraction of an inch from hers. She could feel his breath against her lips. "Granger," he whispered, his voice rough, uncertain. The sound of her last name broke the spell. He didn't know her. He was calling her Granger. He was kissing the annoying ministry bureaucrat he had hated in school, driven entirely by the proximity of a magic he didn't understand. Hermione jerked backward, ripping her hand out of his grip. Draco recoiled as if he had been slapped. Hermione scrambled backward across the floor, knocking over a stack of scrolls. Her chest heaved. Tears flooded her eyes, hot and sudden and entirely unwanted. "Don't," she choked out, holding her hand against her chest. Draco watched her, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He looked utterly thrown. He started, his voice cracking. He looked down at his empty hand. The silver scar was throbbing, protesting the sudden distance. "I apologize. I don't know why He trailed off, running a shaking hand through his hair. Because of the vow, Hermione sobbed, the tears finally spilling over. Because the vow is making you. Draco's jaw clenched. I am perfectly capable of distinguishing between a magical compulsion and my own free will, Granger. You don't have free will, she shouted, the words tearing out of her throat. You don't even know why you made it. Then enlighten me, he shouted back, pushing himself to his feet. He towered over her, his eyes blazing. Because nobody will tell me a bloody thing. I wake up in a hospital bed missing 2 years of my life, tethered to a witch I apparently traded my magic for, and every time I get near you, you look at me like I'm a ghost. He stepped toward her. Hermione didn't retreat. She stood up, meeting his furious glare with her own tear-filled eyes. You are a ghost, she cried. The Draco Malfoy I know is gone. He died in the Department of Mysteries. Silence slammed into the room. Draco stopped dead. The anger drained out of his face, leaving behind a stark, terrifying pale mask. What? He whispered. Hermione wrapped her arms tightly around herself, trying to hold her shattering heart together. We were working on a joint task force, she said, her voice shaking violently. Cursebreakers and Aurors. You had been an Auror for a year. Draco studied her, unblinking. We were fighting. She continued, a bitter, broken laugh escaping her lips. Constantly. You criticized my wand work. I criticized your blatant disregard for protocol. We couldn't be in the same room without starting a shouting match. Draco didn't move. He didn't speak. But then we weren't fighting, Hermione whispered. We were hiding in the restricted archives on our lunch breaks, pretending we were doing research. You started coming to my flat in Muggle London on the weekends. We drank cheap wine on my fire escape. We were so careful. Nobody knew. Not Harry. Not Ron. Not your parents. Draco took a slow step backward, as if her words were physically striking him. We were assigned to raid a rogue faction in the Department of Mysteries, Hermione said, the tears falling freely now. It was an ambush. They cornered us in the time room. She looked at his wrist. A killing curse missed me by an inch, she whispered. I dropped my wand. I was completely defenseless. Draco looked down at the silver scar. You grabbed my arm, Hermione said, her voice breaking on a sob. You pulled me behind you. And you made the vow. You bound your magic to my life force to create a localized absolute shield. You didn't even hesitate. Draco didn't speak. He looked like he was suffocating. The shield deflected the next curse. Hermione finished, wiping her eyes fiercely. But the magical backlash of making a vow in combat, it shattered the floor. You fell. And you didn't wake up. She looked at him. Really looked at him. The man who had saved her life. The man who had loved her, and who now only felt the echoes of it through a cursed scar. You don't remember. She whispered. You're only trying to kiss me because your magic is confused. But it's not real, Malfoy. You don't remember loving me. Draco stood completely still. He looked at her with wide, hollow eyes. Instead of arguing or claiming it was real, he simply turned on his heel and walked out of the room. Draco Malfoy did not handle a lack of control well. He handled the complete dissolution of his known reality even worse. After leaving Granger on the drawing room floor, he had gone straight to his private study. He had locked the door, warded it against intrusion, and proceeded to tear the room apart. He was looking for proof. He was looking for a lie. He didn't know which one he wanted more. For 3 hours, he dismantled his own life. He emptied drawers, vanished false bottoms in antique cabinets, and sifted through hundreds of files. He found it at 2:30 in the morning. It was a small, unassuming black box, hidden behind a blood-warded brick in the fireplace mantel. Only his magical signature could open it. Draco sat on the floor of the study, surrounded by scattered parchment, looking down at the contents of the box. There were 3 items inside. The first was a pair of Muggle cinema tickets, dated January 2003. The second was a small, silver hairpin, shaped like a raven. The third was a moving photograph. Draco picked up the photograph with trembling fingers. It was taken from his own perspective. The camera was slightly unsteady. It showed Hermione Granger sitting on the rusted metal of a Muggle fire escape, holding a glass of dark red wine. She was wearing one of his expensive dress shirts. It swallowed her completely. She was laughing. It wasn't a polite laugh. It was a full, head thrown back, brilliant laugh. The kind of laugh that took up all the air in a room. In the photograph, the camera shifted closer to her, and she reached out, her hand covering the lens as if trying to push the photographer away. But she was smiling. She was looking at the camera with an expression of such unguarded, overwhelming affection that it made Draco's chest physically ache. She had looked at him like that. He traced the edge of the photograph. The witch in the picture was vibrant, while the witch currently sleeping 2 rooms away was a shadow, ground down by 2 years of hospital waiting rooms and grief. He had done that to her, he had saved her life, and in doing so, he had destroyed the version of her that laughed on fire escapes. Draco closed his eyes, dropping his head back against the stone of the fireplace. He didn't remember the cinema. He didn't remember buying the hairpin. He didn't remember taking the photograph. The blank space in his mind was a physical weight. It was a vast, terrifying ocean of nothingness. But as he sat there in the dark, the silver scar on his right wrist began to hum. It wasn't the sharp, burning agony of distance. It was a low, resonant vibration. A steady thrum that bypassed his fractured memory and spoke directly to his magical core. The magic remembered. The vow wasn't a curse. It wasn't a punishment designed to torture him. It was a tether. He had woven his own magic into her life force because he hadn't trusted anyone else to keep her safe. He had anchored himself to her, making it impossible for him to ever truly leave her behind. The hum in his wrist grew stronger. It wasn't pulling him in a panic. It was simply asking him to move. A gentle, insistent tug in the direction of the east wing. Draco put the items back into the black box. He stood up, his muscles stiff from sitting on the floor, and walked out of the study. The manor was completely silent. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a heavy, damp quiet. He walked down the long, shadowed corridors. He didn't bother lighting his wand. The pull in his wrist was a perfect compass. He stopped outside the door to her bedroom. The connecting door to his own suite was firmly shut. He stood in the hallway, looking at the heavy oak panels. He didn't knock. He didn't want to give her the chance to tell him to go away. He pushed the door open. The room was dark, save for the weak moonlight filtering through the tall windows. Granger wasn't asleep. She was sitting on the edge of the large 4-poster bed, wrapped in the thick green sweater with her knees pulled to her chest. She gazed blankly at the wall, her face pale in the moonlight. She looked up when the door clicked shut behind him, but she didn't look surprised to see him. She just looked incredibly, profoundly tired. "I didn't think you would come back," she said. Her voice was quiet, flat. Draco walked into the room. He didn't stop until he was standing a few feet from the edge of the bed. "I found a box," Draco said simply. His voice sounded remarkably steady, given the absolute chaos inside his chest. "Behind the mantel in my study." Blood warded. Granger went perfectly still. Draco reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph. He held it out to her. She didn't take it. She just looked at it. A small, broken sound escaped her throat. She squeezed her eyes shut, turning her face away from the picture. "Put it away," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Please, Malfoy. Just put it away." Draco didn't put it away. He stepped closer, tossing the photograph onto the mattress beside her. "I took that," he stated. It wasn't a question. Granger opened her eyes, looking down at the moving image of herself laughing. "Yes. After a shift. We went to a muggle market." Draco looked at her. He looked at the heavy shadows under her eyes, the defensive way she held her own shoulders, the way she seemed entirely ready for him to walk out again. "I don't remember it," Draco said. The words were brutal. He knew they were brutal. He saw her flinch as if he had struck her. "I know," she said hollowly. "You've made that perfectly clear." "I don't remember the cinema tickets, Granger," Draco continued, his voice dropping into a fierce, intense register. "I don't remember buying the hairpin. I don't remember what cheap muggle wine tastes like, or what your flat looks like." He took another step closer. He was standing directly in front of her now. "I don't have the memories," he said, holding her gaze. "And I don't know if I will ever get them back." Granger looked up at him. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Then why are you here?" Draco looked down at his right arm. He slowly unbuttoned the cuff of his shirt, rolling the white fabric up to his elbow. He held his wrist out between them. The silver scar was glowing. It was a bright, steady, beautiful light that illuminated the space between them in the dark room. "Because of this," Draco said softly. Granger eyed the scar. "I told you. It's a compulsion. It's forcing you stop," Draco interrupted, his tone sharp. "Stop analyzing it. Stop trying to break it down into arithmancy and spell theory." He dropped to one knee, bringing himself level with her where she sat on the edge of the bed. Reaching out, he didn't grab her, but instead laid his right hand gently over both of hers where they were clasped around her knees. The moment his skin touched hers, the vow flared. It didn't burn. It sang. A rush of pure, unadulterated warmth flooded his veins, settling deep into his chest. It felt like coming home. Granger gasped, her breath catching in her throat at the sudden surge of magic. "It's my magic, Hermione," Draco whispered. It was the first time he had used her given name. The syllables felt unfamiliar on his tongue, but entirely right in his mouth. "It's my core. And it knows you." She looked at him, her eyes wide, a tear finally spilling over her lashes and tracking down her cheek. "It knows you," Draco repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "It knows that you are the most important thing in the world to it. It knows that keeping you safe is its only fundamental purpose. He slid his hand up her arm, his fingers wrapping gently around her elbow through the thick wool of the sweater. I may not have the memories in my head, Draco said, his grey eyes locked onto hers. But my magic remembers. My body remembers. Hermione let out a shuddering breath. Malfoy. Draco, he corrected softly. I highly doubt we called each other by our surnames while drinking wine on a fire escape. A tiny, wet laugh broke through her tears. No. We didn't. He moved closer, lifting his other hand to cup her face. He brushed the tear from her cheek with his thumb. Her skin was incredibly soft. The scent of vanilla and old parchment surrounded him, overwhelmingly familiar and painfully distant all at once. I want them back, Draco whispered, his gaze dropping to her mouth. I want to remember why you were laughing in that photograph. Hermione leaned into his hand, closing her eyes. I can't just give them back to you. I know, Draco murmured, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. But you can help me make new ones. Hermione opened her eyes. They were wide, searching his face for any sign of hesitation. She found none. Are you sure? She asked, her voice trembling. Because if you do this, and you still don't remember, if you decide you don't want this. I made an unbreakable vow to protect you, Hermione, Draco said fiercely. I literally tied my soul to yours. I am fairly certain I am not going to change my mind. She let out a breath that sounded like a sob. Draco didn't wait any longer. He leaned in, bridging the final gap between them, and pressed his mouth to hers. The kiss wasn't hesitant. It was a collision. The second their lips met, the silver scar on Draco's wrist flared with a light so bright it briefly blinded him. The magic surged through him, fierce and triumphant, a wave of absolute rightness that swept away the last lingering shadows in his mind. He pulled her closer, his hands tangling in her messy curls, angling her head to deepen the kiss. Hermione responded instantly. Her hands came up, grabbing the lapels of his shirt, pulling him tightly against her chest. She kissed him back with a desperate, starving intensity. It was clumsy. It was desperate. It tasted like salt and tears and bergamot. And it was perfect. Draco didn't remember their first kiss in the archives. He didn't remember the thousands of kisses that had apparently followed it. But as he held her there in the dark, feeling the frantic beat of her heart against his chest and the absolute contentment of his magical core, he knew one thing with terrifying certainty. He was never going to let her go again. 6 months later, the morning sun was streaming through the massive bay windows of the Malfoy Manor kitchen. Hermione was running exactly 10 minutes late. She was rushing around the marble island, a piece of toast clamped between her teeth, trying to charm her briefcase shut while simultaneously levitating a stack of ministry files into a neat pile. It was chaotic. It was loud. It was perfectly domestic. Granger, if you drop that file on your foot, my magic is going to interpret it as a lethal attack. Draco was leaning against the counter near the stove. He was wearing dark, tailored trousers and a pale grey shirt that looked impossibly crisp for 8 in the morning. He was holding a steaming mug of black coffee, watching her with a look of supreme, highly practiced amusement. It's just a file, Hermione mumbled around the toast. It's a heavily charmed ministry dossier, Draco corrected, taking a slow sip of his coffee. Last week you gave yourself a paper cut, and the vow nearly pulled me through the flu network. You overreacted, she said, finally pulling the toast from her mouth and tossing it onto a plate. Both of you. Draco raised a pale eyebrow. He set his mug down and walked around the island toward her. He moved with an easy, fluid grace. He had fully recovered his strength months ago, and the healers had returned his wand just before Christmas. But the most obvious change wasn't physical. It was the lack of shadows in his eyes. He stopped in front of her. He reached out, his long fingers gently batting her wand away, and effortlessly snapped the latch of her briefcase shut with a flick of wandless magic. "I did not overreact," Draco said smoothly. "I am merely hypervigilant. It is a side effect of being magically tethered to a walking disaster." "I am not a disaster," Hermione argued, though she was smiling. "You burned the toast yesterday," he pointed out. "The vow woke me from a dead sleep because it thought the manor was on fire. It was slightly charred. It was carbon, Hermione." She laughed. It was a bright, genuine sound that echoed off the high ceilings of the kitchen. Draco's expression softened instantly. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them. He lifted his right hand and brushed a stray curl away from her face, tucking it behind her ear. The silver scar around his wrist was visible beneath the rolled-up cuff of his shirt. It didn't look like a jagged wound anymore. The angry, glowing light had faded months ago. Now, it looked like a thin, delicate bracelet of spun silver. It hummed constantly, a quiet, contented vibration that felt like a heartbeat against her own skin whenever he touched her. "You're going to be late," Draco murmured, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "I know," Hermione whispered, suddenly entirely unconcerned with the time. She leaned into his touch. They had spent the last 6 months rebuilding. It hadn't been perfectly smooth. There had been arguments, and moments of intense, suffocating frustration on both sides. Draco still didn't have his memories back. The healers had concluded that the trauma of the vow's creation had permanently erased the 2 years prior to the coma. At first, it had broken her heart all over again. But then, Draco had systematically set about proving that it didn't matter. He had insisted on taking her on a first date to a Muggle coffee shop in London, bringing a notepad to interrogate her for 2 hours about her favourite books, her irrational fear of flying, and her exact tea order. Later, he had kissed her under the awning in the pouring rain, deliberately ignoring the stares of passing Muggles as he fell in love with her all over again, entirely on purpose. "Are you going to the office today?" Hermione asked, resting her hands against the crisp fabric of his shirt. Eventually, Draco replied, his gaze dropping to her mouth. "I have a meeting with the Board of Governors at noon. Then I am coming home." He slid his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. The silver thread on his wrist flared with a soft, warm light, purring in satisfaction at the proximity. Hermione rested her chin on his chest, looking up at him. "You know, the healers said the vow might fade entirely once your magical core stabilized." "The healers are idiots," Draco said dismissively. "They also said I wouldn't wake up." "They were just offering a prognosis," Hermione said, hiding a smile. "They thought the tether might eventually dissolve if there was no active threat to my life." Draco's arms tightened around her. "It's not dissolving," he said firmly. "No," Hermione agreed softly, looking at the silver band on his wrist. "It isn't." He shifted his right hand, tangling his fingers with hers. He brought her hand up to his chest, pressing her palm flat over his heart. "It isn't a curse, Hermione," Draco said. The teasing banter was gone, replaced by a quiet, fierce sincerity. "It never was." Hermione swallowed hard, the familiar prick of tears stinging the corners of her eyes. You lost 2 years of your life because of it. I gained you because of it. He countered immediately. He didn't hesitate. He never hesitated anymore when it came to her. If we were in the Department of Mysteries today, Draco said, his voice dropping into a low, steady register. If a curse was flying at you right now, I would make the exact same choice. Hermione looked at him. She looked at the absolute certainty in his grey eyes. You don't even remember making it, she whispered. I don't need to, Draco replied. He lifted her hand, pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles. I know exactly why I did it. He looked at her, his expression stripping away the last of the aristocratic armor he used for the rest of the world. I love you, Granger. He murmured. Hermione's heart swelled, a massive, overwhelming wave of affection crashing through her chest. I love you too, she whispered back. Draco smiled. It was a rare, genuine expression that transformed his sharp features into something breathtakingly handsome. He leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't desperate like the kiss in her bedroom 6 months ago. It was slow, deep, and impossibly sweet. It was the kiss of a man who knew exactly what he had, and had the rest of his life to prove it. Hermione kissed him back, wrapping her arms around his neck, letting her briefcase fall completely forgotten to the marble floor. The silver scar on Draco's wrist flared with a brilliant, blinding light, matching the sudden, joyous spike of magic in her own veins. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't a tether dragging him across the country. It was just a promise. A vow he finally remembered how to keep. The end.